So just a quick recap, and then I'll talk about some practical examples from my company. So our CTO, Chief Technology Officer, always insists that we begin all discussions about technology with just reminding people what exponential growth means. So this is the very famous example of the grain of rice on the 64 squares of a chessboard. I think he reckons we're about halfway through the chessboard. They go back to 2002 when I suppose people think that the digital age really started, or you could go back to even further. But either way, Moore's law, I think, was doubling of computer processing every 2 years. And the exponential power of computing is literally almost impossible to imagine. So we're living in a world... oops, sorry. You just click that back for me.
The button to the right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Where we have, as some people have talked about already, the importance of data to the consumer. Here's some examples of, they're slightly outdated now. I think Facebook, is over 200 million in the US, and it's now, nearly 1 billion? 800 million, I think Timothy said earlier. I think it's probably near 1 billion users. So the consumers are now using big data all the time. We are a B2B business at Thomson Reuters. Reuters is one of our companies. I'll explain a little bit more detail in a second what we do. But the cloud, in other words, servers on the ground, not in the cloud, is a huge market. So processing, managing, storing data is a huge business. And we've had to rise to that challenge, and these are some of the services that are available today. And of course, even more recently, the development of apps. So what we think is that we're at an inflection point. In our businesses, we would argue, we hate the phrase big data, by the way, because we reckon we've been doing data management since the 1970s and 80s. But big data is the phrase we're using today. We think we're at an inflection point. We're a content company. We're a digital content company. And the world of content has exploded, partly just due to the sheer volume of content available. But the content is increasingly commoditized, and I'll explain what that means as a challenge for our business. In particular, the tools. Maureen used the word tool earlier. It's absolutely right. There is a tool, so whether you're in a science business, a hospital, the police, in my previous example, or security services, there's enormously powerful tools. The example of the Children's Hospital in Toronto is one I've heard of before. The difference there, to be very clear, what that meant was the doctors could not see the pattern, right? Children were dying, babies were dying in Toronto Hospital. By analysing the pattern, big data, they managed to see that there was a pattern which no individual doctor, pediatrician had seen, right? It's a fantastic example of the use of big data, and the pattern was basically the baby stabilised, and then they got a fever and they died. When each individual baby stabilised, they thought, great, baby's cured. They saw the pattern of the 24-hour period of stability. That's the kind of thing we're talking about. On the consumer side, the younger generation in particular expect to be able to access data at all points on every gadget, on every device, full access availability. And we are, I think we say, we human beings, somebody talked about humans earlier, we're barely ahead of machines in being able to process the information. So what that means, I think, for business is a very positive form of disruptive innovation. IBM Watson processes, I think it's 1 million books a second in their tracking of their, particularly their medical research. Some of these companies are tracking sentiment, tracking the social web, Twitter and Facebook and all this kind of stuff is hugely, huge source of data. You're finding that companies can predict, I think one of them on here, the next big sound predicts music choice. What would have taken you a very long time to do in terms of market research, even just a few years ago, you can now simply do it at the press of a button. And of course, people are using technology in different ways. They want to be able to touch screens and slide things, all those things you see on the science fiction programs, they're kind of here, right, already. Let me talk a little bit about what that means for us. So Thomson Reuters, as I said, is a content company. The origins were Reuters, that's Mr. Reuter. and his pigeons. So I don't know whether people know, but early access information. So he put pigeons in Cove, the port near Cork in the west of Ireland, where the ships from America docked. Got the news first to London, and then on to by wire, to the capitals of what was in the ships coming into Cork. Right, that was early data, not so much big data in those days. Now we've grown to be the big financial data company, Thomson Reuters, what we call our financial and risk business. We have Thomson bought Reuters about 4 years ago, about 7 years ago. Sorry. Thomson is the world's biggest legal information business. So the world of lawyers, so Westlaw to Americans in the room, Sweeten Maxwell to English lawyers, Carswell to Canadian lawyers. The days of going to a lawyer and finding shelves and shelves of books of jurisprudence have gone. Jurisprudence is all digitized, it's public information, it's digitized, and it's turned into workflow solutions. We have a science business, the Derwent Patent Index. We have the world's biggest index of patents. So your pharmaceutical companies in Finland can check the Chinese patents quickly, instantaneously, and of course vice versa. The Chinese companies can check the European patents. We have a trademark database, we have a scientific research database. That kind of information is now readily available in digitized information. We have a tax and accounting business, similar model. And of course we have Reuters.